Hello, everyone. We are so excited to have you all here for our seventh annual Technology, Sustainability, and Business Forum, where we bring together leaders from industry, finance, academia, and not for profit sectors to discuss matters pertaining to sustainability. My name is Daniel Tachik. I'm the executive director of Carnegie Mellon's Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. And as a university wide institute focusing on energy and sustainability, we focus on developing and demonstrating the technologies, the systems, and policies needed to accelerate the transition to a more sustainable future. And part of the way that we do that is by collaborating to run events like this one to help educate and inspire new ideas that drive sustainable business. Today's event is co-hosted by the Scott Institute and the Tepper School of Business here at CMU. So a special thanks to Nick Muller and Ashley Kluginski over at Tepper for helping put together what's going to be a great program for today. So I'm super excited for today's panelists who have some very interesting insights to share. So to keep from taking away time from them, excuse me, I will pass things off to Cooper Meinhardt, a doctoral student in engineering and public policy, and Amrita Alangavan, an MBA student in the Tepper School, to introduce today's speakers and moderate today's discussion. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for introduction. So today we have leaders from industry, finance, academia, and government discussing issues in our industry. So our panelists include Joe Aldy from Kennedy School, Vilas from Bank of America, and Chad Willis from Allegheny Airport Authority, and Zeke father from Stripe. So will them introduce themselves one by one. Joe, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, I'm Joe Aldy. I'm the Teresa and John Heinz Professor of the Practice of Environmental Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. At Harvard, I also serve as the faculty chair to the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability's Climate Action Accelerator. And that's how we try to take the ideas from research and translate so they can be acted upon in the world of practice.
Thanks, Joe. And Vilas, do you want to go next in introducing yourself?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for hosting this. So Vilas Kuchinad, I am what we call the head of innovation for our infrastructure and sustainable finance team at Bank of America. We'll get into kind of what those responsibilities entail, but we are effectively working across all business lines to think about how the bank meets its goal of 1.5 trillion of sustainable finance and infrastructure finance by 2030. And my team specifically is focused on some of the emerging climate technologies that are necessary to develop over the next couple decades. So again, thanks for having me.
Amazing. Thank you, Vilas. Next, we'll go to Chad. Hi, Chad. Thanks for being here. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Chad Willis, I am the Vice President for Planning, Environment, and Sustainability at Allegheny County Airport Authority. Here at the Airport Authority, we manage directly Pittsburgh International Airport and Allegheny County Airport as well. A lot of what I focus on here in these roles are building out sustainable projects into the future, things like energy efficiency projects, as well as some really interesting alternative energy programs for hydrogen and SAF that I'll talk about a little later.
Thanks, Chad. And lastly, we have Zeke Hausfather. Hi, Zeke. You want to introduce yourself?
Thanks. So I'm Zeke Hausfather. I'm the climate research lead at Stripe and a research scientist with Berkeley Earth. I'm also an author of the recent U.S. National Climate Assessment and a lead author of the upcoming IPCC 7th Assessment Report, Working Group 1. With Stripe, I work on a project called Frontier, which is an advanced market commitment along with Google, McKinsey, JP Morgan, Shopify, Salesforce, and a number of other companies that are collectively spending $1 billion on developing durable carbon removal technologies.
Definitely. Thank you so much for all the panelists introducing themselves, and we'll go forward with questions. And Cooper, do you want to take the lead in questions?
Yeah, let's get into it. So you each got introduced yourself and gotten a little bit into your professional role, but let's dig a little bit deeper. Could each of you discuss what your professional role is and how that relates to sustainability? And let's start by defining what sustainability means to you and how you can measure it. Joe, would you like to take this one first?
Sure, great. Thanks, Cooper. So I'm an academic. I'm trained as an economist, but I've also worked several times in the federal government at the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Economic Council, and the Office of Energy and Climate Change. So a lot of what I do is try to think about how do we bring the tools of economics to address key questions in sustainability. That starts with, to get to Cooper's question, how do we think about defining sustainability through an economic lens for policy? Big picture, we want to make sure that we're able to meet the needs of today's generation while we're preparing to ensure improvement in well-being across time and across generations to come. And in practice, that means we need to start to think through about how we can marshal evidence to understand what are the economic impacts and the environmental impacts and the social impacts of the different policies we're advancing to try to deliver on that overall goal. So that means we marshal this evidence to understand the benefits and the cost of policies that might be, say, improving air quality or addressing climate change, addressing concerns about biodiversity. All these are different forms of natural capital that we need to sustain in order for future generations to be better off. But we need to recognize that there may be trade-offs, that what we do to help sustain for the future may impose costs today, and we need to understand whether or not the benefits of incurring those costs can justify those kinds of policies and investments. So part of this at the end of the day means thinking through that weighing of benefits and cost. Part of it means also assessing who's bearing those benefits and costs and informing our understanding about the distribution that also matters, so that we recognize that not just are we improving the well-being on average, but are we sharing that improvement in well-being across the whole of the affected populations. So that's a lot sort of in the abstract that I do, and I bring that both in my teaching as well as in my policy engagement, and in the past when I've been wearing the hat of helping to coordinate the policy process when I've worked in government. Cooper?
Yeah, absolutely. So not only how you're measuring it, but also then how you're implementing those measurements and how you're weighting the different aspects of it. Absolutely. Thank you. Vilas, would you like to go next? Touch on your
Sure.
professional role and how it relates to sustainability and your working definition of it.
Yeah. And one thing I forgot in my intro is I am a very proud Tepper, or before it was Tepper, alumni, so TSIA back in 01. So, and didn't have these types of things. So thank you again. But, when I really think about sustainability and where the bank plays a role, and, there's, at the end of the day, we are very client driven, right? We follow our clients' needs and respond to them, typically with capital, but also with advice, with access to capital markets, with, kind of a convening power that we have. And so when I take a step back and think about why we do the work we do, our team was founded in 2020, beginning of the year. So we're a little over 5 years that we've kind of been at this specifically. And even before then, we had an environmental business initiative back in 2007, 2008, and we've always set goals, kind of related to sustainability. I think it's just had different names over time. The goal that we set in 2050 was really driven for 2050 was, driven as others were setting goals about net zero. And we set an interim goal for 2030, which was a 21 to 2030 10-year goal about financing, because we really were hearing from our clients that they needed to change how they were doing business. And that was going to involve capital, right? To Joe's point, there's a cost. And, there's just a monetary cost that is involved. And so we really looked at it and said, okay, well, how are we going to support our clients? And that 1.5 trillion, I should be clear, is broken down a couple of ways. One is 1 trillion is for energy and environment, and about 500 billion is for what we call social capital. And so, those cross over, and sometimes, things can be both. But, we really looked at it and said, okay, what's the quantum that's going to need to be, invested? And the reason why we looked at it, in that manner, and in a manner of what's on our balance sheet and what can we use our convening power and our capital markets, mandates, because it's not always just the bank's capital that is necessary. And the reason I bring this up is I mentioned, my team specifically focuses on a lot of newer technologies. And when we think about how we support companies that have new technologies that are more nascent, bank capital isn't always the right capital for that, right? It's very risky, so we think about the venture capital that firms that we work with and private equity firms. And so it's not always the right capital that we have. And so pulling in, the companies, the funds, et cetera, that we work with is also necessary. I think just the last thing, that when I think about sustainability, like, why are we doing it, right? Like, there's a capital S sustainability, and I always say there's a lowercase s sustainability. And the reason why, companies are coming to us and why we are thinking even of our own emissions and our own footprint is because we need to think of both S's, right? So we do need to think about, our impact on the environment and our impact that we have that influences the success not only of our business, but, I think Joe mentioned it again, like humanity's ability to continue to thrive in our environment. But there's also a lowercase s, which I think is, at the end of the day, I don't want to, put more importance on one, but how do you ensure that you have a lowercase f sustainable business moving forward? Meaning you can play in the environment that exists, right? So we are a financial company, but we work with lots of other companies, right? Like we work with real estate companies. Like how are they dealing with the fact that it is, there is climate change? We work with, agricultural companies. How do they, deal with that temperature changes and weather patterns are changing, make their their revenue profiles more challenging. So all of that kind of goes into how we really assess sustainability overall and the opportunity and particularly the imperative that there is for us to, be an active player and supportive of what companies are doing to have that lowercase s business.
Yeah, really interesting to hear it coming, like you said, coming from the demand side and hearing your customers demanding this and finding ways to deliver that, and then also looking at the different ways to define sustainability and bring in the social side, for sure. All right, thank you. Chad, would you like to go next?
Yeah. So really here at Pittsburgh International Airport, I have a kind of dual role, if you will. So here, very locally, we're managing facilities, right? So in that regard, I really kind of define our sustainability role as active management of all of those, environmental, social, economic impacts to make sure that we can, deliver for our community what they expect from facilities that we have here, but also to do that in a socially responsible way. Kind of on the other lens, I serve on a number of roles in aviation-related industry working groups, right? So I work with a group called Airports Council International, as well as the United Nations has a group called ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization. And with those organizations, really, we're focusing on how worldwide we're able to do what we can to improve the entire aviation sector and to decarbonize it, worldwide, which is a humongous goal that has, a million kind of strings that we can pull. The ultimate goal is to be able to, provide a service that has become, extremely important from our economic, world perspective, but also to do that in a way that is really going to be socially and environmentally responsible over the long term. Here locally at Pitt, we do lots of traditional sustainability related things. We have tons of metrics that we analyze to make sure that we're following through on our commitments and improving here locally. But really, I think the bigger impacts come from those things that we help to influence globally on the aviation, like worldwide scale.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, earlier, and then mentioned again facility management. Are both of those linked into your work at the airports here locally?
Yeah, and I can go into as much detail as you guys really want to hear from me on those things, but from a facilities management perspective, we are working very, very diligently here on our actual airport campus. We have about 9,000 acres with lots and lots of other businesses that are located here to make sure that we reduce those footprints associated to facilities. And we do that. We have a microgrid here on site that's powered by a combination of natural gas and renewable energy from solar facilities. And that has played a big role in reducing our actual campus footprints for emissions. But on the kind of bigger scale, we have been focusing the last several years on how to build out a sustainable aviation fuel plant here locally in Pittsburgh on our airport. And what that would do is essentially provide a renewable fuel source that is not based in fossil fuels, right? So any carbon associated with as part of our existing carbon cycle, and provide that to not only airlines that operate here in Pittsburgh, but also to airlines in our region to really help reduce the impacts from those operations.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Well, I could talk to you about that for decades, I think. Thank you for the overview. Zeke, would you like to go next, discussing your role in sustainability and your definition of it?
Sure. And Vilas and Chad touched on this a little bit, but when we think of sustainability, traditionally, a lot of it has been focused on reducing the impact that your organization has on the environment, having a net zero target, mitigating your emissions, and all of that is critically important. But I do think we're also starting to see a new type of sustainability focus emerge in the last few years, which is companies stepping back and saying, okay, how can we be most catalytic? Where are spaces that we need solutions in the future that we don't have them today? Sustainable aviation fuel is a good example. And how can we, as the private sector, put the resources we have to best use there, particularly in areas where governments, for one reason or another, are not filling in those gaps. And so there's a number of different examples of this that are happening today. Google's 24/7 clean energy is a good one, and obviously the work we're doing with Frontier and Stripe. And there's a bit of a backstory there. How this ended up getting started is essentially our CEO at Stripe, Patrick Collison, read the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees that came out in 2018. And that report had a big focus on this technology in the latter part of the 21st century called carbon removal, that essentially we're probably going to overshoot our temperature targets and we're going to need to bring temperatures back down and deploy, tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of resources toward removing carbon from the atmosphere. And none of that existed back in 2018. It was all just in models. There was like a shipping container in Switzerland that was like the first direct air capture prototype, but that was about it. And so he had the idea of saying, well, maybe we can put a little bit of resources toward this to like fund some initial ideas and just figure out what actually works here. Because it's easy to develop things in models. It's a lot harder to build things in the real world. And so that started initially through Stripe Climate. And then, when it was successful, it was leveraged up to this $1 billion advanced market commitment with Frontier. And the broad idea behind an advanced market commitment is essentially, if you want to start a company, say, removing carbon from the atmosphere or even creating sustainable aviation fuel, if there's not a clear market for that product, if there are not buyers willing to actually buy it, it is incredibly hard to actually build a company, to get investors, to do any of those things. And so by putting out enough money in a pool that was guaranteed to be spent on a product if it worked, you really create a demand pull. You create an incentive for companies to start, and you create an incentive for an industry to develop. And our goal with Frontier is not necessarily to maximize the amount of tons that are being removed from the atmosphere right now, but rather to use this decade to figure out what works and what can scale, to maximize shots on goal, as we say. And so we're not just, doing the cheapest thing, which today is often biomass-based carbon removals, but we're also trying out new and spending money on new direct air capture approaches, on enhanced rock weathering, superficial mineralization, ocean alkalinity enhancement, bio-oil injection, biomass burial. There's a huge list of different approaches. And until we try them in the real world, until we start scaling them up, we're not going to know which is the most promising. We're not going to know what necessarily works. And so, this idea of using sustainability to be catalytic, to change the world in a big way, to develop technologies that we're going to need to meet our climate goals that we don't have today, I think is a neat approach. And it's one we're starting to see, not just with Stripe and Frontier, but a number of companies pursue.
And just for a little bit of context, Frontier is Stripe's and other partner organization for specifically carbon capture and sequestration.
Yeah, so Frontier is a fund that is managed by Stripe, but has Google, Meta, McKinsey, Shopify, JP Morgan, a number of other companies all contributing to it. And it's a little over $1 billion of money that is going to be spent on durable carbon removal technologies by 2030.
Okay, very cool. Thank you. Great. Let's step back for a second, and you answered much of this in your previous or in the last question. But let's think about how each of your individual sectors of the economy, you each come from a different sector of the economy, local government, finance, federal government, and academia. How do you view your specific sector in the economy and how it relates to sustainability? Are there specific actions or specific levers that your sector is capable of pushing on most effectively? Zeke, you got into a little bit of this where Stripe is capable of organizing and pushing on finance levers, and Chad, you talked about SAF. Are there other things that you see as specific catalysts, like you said, or specific things that your sector is particularly well focused or well positioned to focus on? Joe, do you want to start again?
Sure. So let me start, with the perspective from academia, but note importantly how I think academia helps serve as a kind of foundation for action in other sectors. Where we have a comparative advantage is in developing new ideas, developing insights, producing evidence, and in a sense, providing both the kind of information base for us to be able to assess, how sustainable are we doing now on whatever dimension we're looking at, whether it's something at a local level, whether we're trying to think about it from the national level or even globally, what kind of information, what kind of data, how do we process and analyze that to be able to assess kind of where we are right now. A lot of this is going to be important. I think we've already heard this from some of the other panelists about how we're actually able to measure this is going to be critical to how we make progress on sustainability. So I think it starts within the academy. Where can we actually produce the kind of tools and methods that can then be applied in various contexts, whether it's in the private sector or by governments or in civil society? I think the second thing too is then how do we help bring these ideas so that they can be acted upon? How do we engage in the policy environment, for example? There's ways we in the academy do this. As I noted, I've gone and worked a couple times in the federal government. There's ways we can serve as advisors and formally serve on advisory committees to government agencies. There's ways we may work with private sector entities or civil society organizations who, as key stakeholders, are the ones who engage in the policy process and the political process to help move ideas about how we craft policy that influences sustainability, how we craft that policy, design it, and then implement it. So I think that's where in the academy, at the end of the day, I mean, we could measure. We do have colleagues here, and I work with them some at Harvard to assess what's the emissions footprint of our campus and our operations. I think it's important for us to be on top of that and understand that, and there's actually opportunities for us to engage our students as a learning vehicle for that. But more importantly, I think we're more effective in driving sustainability in the broader society when we're able to bring these ideas that can be acted upon by decision makers and stakeholders in other sectors. I like to think of our work as being like an important input and a foundation for the actions by those players in other sectors of the economy.
Yeah, particularly your role in being kind of like you were saying, facilitating the transition between academia and implementation as well. Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Does anybody want to go next? Otherwise, we can just go down the list too.
I'm happy to jump in then. So I think it was interesting to hear Chad and Zeke's perspectives as well, and how they're thinking about it, because I really think, yes, we all have our specific roles to play, but it's really about, convening all of the different roles, as Joe just said. I think about, the role of government, which we are not clearly, but in setting policy, right? Whether that policy is regulation, whether that policy is incentives, but that's a market signal as well, right? I think about the role of, industry, which is, let's say Chad's, kind of representing industry in respect to aviation, and saying like, hey, we are trying to enable this for our customers, right? And frankly, airports customers, yes, we all go travel through airports, but their customers are also the airlines. And the airlines are trying to decarbonize. And so they, need partners like Chad to say, hey, we're going to try and get fuel here, right? And we're going to try and do things that allow you to meet your goals. And then there really is, kind of the end users and corporates and consumers who are demand signals that Zeke brought up, right? That are very much sitting there and saying like, yes, we're willing to say it's important to us. And the last part of that is we're willing to pay for it. Because I think one of the things at the end of the day, being a capital provider, is we have to do things, and I think companies have to do things, and individuals have to do things that make economic sense. Right? There, obviously there are incentives that exist, and there are policy, as I mentioned, but to get something to be lowercase f sustainable, it has to make economic sense. And so people need to say, yes, there's a path to that. And so I really think about, when we are looking at opportunities, the role we play partially is to say, hey, here's what the cost of capital is, right? And I mentioned it's not always bank capital. There's, venture capital, private equity, corporate strategics that are investing. There's government money that's coming in. And, and then there's hopefully, lending that's also coming in, whether that's from private, credit or from banks, and saying like, well, this is what it costs to do a project. And does it make sense? and that knowing that, that demand is going to be there, I think does drive a lot of innovation as well, because it's saying like, hey, I have a really cool solution, but it doesn't make economic sense. So that you have to drive the cost down, right? That's the most important thing, right? So like, yes, if the technology doesn't work, it doesn't really matter. But it's not just getting the technology to work. And so, one of the things that we have found has been helpful. So we're actually part of an organization called the Minnesota SAF Hub. And what that is actually, a consortium of interested parties. And what do I mean by interested parties? So the local government, the Economic Development Agency, kind of started this. Delta Airlines, which is headquartered, or one of their hubs is in Minneapolis, joined it. They pulled in, some of their ecosystem partners, whether that was on the supply chain side, whether that was on the financing side, like ourselves. We pulled in the local utility, and everybody kind of saying, okay, well, everybody's going to have to do something that frankly is probably outside of what we normally do in our businesses. And we're also going to have to be willing to extend ourselves and be a little bit uncomfortable, and to say that doesn't mean we do things that don't make sense, but it just means that we have to think about doing things maybe in a different way than we traditionally have. Because anytime you're solving like large problems, which at the end of the day, that's what this is, a large societal problem, people have to be willing to kind of change how they think about the problem, because it wouldn't have existed otherwise. So I think that's where, we find, being willing to participate in some of these organizations is very important, besides the things that I mentioned before, which is, like, hey, we have to obviously lend, and we have to provide capital, and we have to provide advice. But I think that's really important to highlight as well, which is, we can all think of our individual roles, but the truth is our individual roles are part of a broader consortium that has to be acting kind of together.
When you say getting into, you said like uncomfortable or like unfamiliar roles like that, is that distinct from working on other capital projects or other finance projects? And is that something that you see as new or like different when you're working on sustainability programs? And I guess, why do you think that is something that's new to like, why do you think that's something that's distinct to a sustainability program, or like you're saying, like a big social problem?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it's distinct to sustainability. I think it's anything that's new that, you have this requirement. I think what I would say is, I don't think before this, role that I've had, I would spend a lot of time with, the procurement department of whatever organization I work for. And I've worked for banks, and I've worked for real estate companies, and I've worked for tech companies, like media. And that was never, I was a frontline employee who had a role to do, whatever I was tasked with. And now, one of the things I do is I actually spend a lot of time with our procurement department, right? Whether it's like, they're working with Zeke and Frontier and talking to them, and they want to hear from, my team saying, hey, does this make sense? Do you think this is a good project from an economic standpoint? Who else have you talked to? But also, I get a lot from talking to them, right? Which is, hey, you're responsible for our supply chain. How do you think about the solutions that are out there today? Where are you not able to solve our supply chain emissions? And, where are you seeing the most pressure? And so that gives us, on the investment side, frankly, a signal, right? And so, it's not just, I think, about these consortiums externally to companies and organizations. I think it's even internally, we have to think differently about how we collaborate, right? To Zeke's point, right? Like, it came from their very senior C-suite level, co-founder who's saying, hey, I, see this, recognize it, right? Like, Zeke, hopefully you don't take offense to this, but like from an outside observer, when I first heard about, Frontier, I was like, why is Stripe doing this? And I was very excited that Stripe was doing it, because that sort of leadership is exactly what we're talking about, which is like, hey, it's not the natural thing, but if you saw an issue, you saw something that affected your company, your clients, and society more broadly, and you said, hey, I think we have expertise, or we have, can bring expertise together, and we can, kind of solve this problem in a way that, traditionally you wouldn't have a payments, kind of company saying like, hey, I'm going to go figure out how we, source the technologies for durable carbon removal that we'll use for the next 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So then, Zeke, to that point, how do you feel your particular model, pulling in corporate finance from Stripe and your other partners, allows you to like push on different levers than you would be able to otherwise?
I mean, it certainly allows us to reach a much bigger scale than we would be able to alone. Like Stripe is a medium-sized company, right? We have 8,000 or so employees. We're not, the scale of a Google or a Microsoft or some of these really massive companies in Silicon Valley. But by playing a coordinating role, by sort of proving that we can do something well ourselves, and then reaching out and saying, hey, we got this thing. It seems to be going well. We're seeing a decent amount of success. Can we join efforts to have a bigger impact? Like that model seems to work quite well. Just having, to be honest, a lot of big problems are much easier to solve if you have a competent project management team working on it. And in many cases, you just don't. And so I think being able to join efforts has really been impactful there. And to Vilas's point, I also think that a lot of sustainability focus from these companies, Stripe included, does come from leadership interest. Many of the CEOs of the biggest companies in the country, are really concerned about issues like climate change. They think they're real. They're not just doing this in order to get, good PR or good press or, make the regulator happy around their, annual report on environmental progress. And I think that does unlock resources that wouldn't necessarily traditionally be used for compliance toward bigger and more impactful projects. To your earlier question, though, around what is our sector, focusing on more broadly, I think one area where there is a huge amount of work being done in the tech sector is on energy, particularly electricity generation for data centers. Because as everyone on the call probably knows, we collectively, the sector is spending hundreds of billions of dollars on building new data centers. It's the largest public investment in infrastructure in history. I think this year alone, we're going to spend something like the equivalent of the entire Apollo program just on data center construction. And that has a big impact on electricity use. And today, a lot of that is, unfortunately, going toward building new natural gas, because that is the fastest way to power for many of these data centers. And so a lot of the companies involved are also spending a lot of money on figuring out ways to both procure more existing clean energy. So the biggest clean energy buyers in the US today are companies like Amazon or Google. But also to figure out how to generate electricity in the future in ways that really match the demands of 24/7 usage that are associated with these data centers. So we've seen, 3 Mile Island being reopened by Microsoft in a deal that they did. Similar deal announced recently with Google for a closed nuclear reactor in Iowa. We've seen a huge amount of new investments in startups for things like enhanced geothermal, small modular reactors, long duration battery storage. And even, our team at Stripe, we published a paper along with Scale Microgrid and Paces at the start of the year, looking at the potential for off-grid data centers with solar and batteries with gas backup, and found that, it would be maybe 20% more expensive on a per kilowatt hour basis, but it might actually be faster in a world of constrained grid hookups and a big backlog on big natural gas turbines. If you have land and you're somewhere like West Texas where the permitting is easy, you can just build a huge amount of power really quickly today. And so that might be a clean way for many of these data centers to get off the ground. So I think that's an area where, there's a huge amount of impact, potentially negative, but also potentially positive, that the technology sector can have in coming years.
Yeah, absolutely. Bring up the interconnection queue and the opportunity cost of not being able to run those data centers is huge. Yeah, thank you. Well, and also thank you for bringing it back to the question, because I had gone on a slight tangent. And then with that, I'll bring it back to Amrita. I
Yeah.
want to introduce our next question.
Yeah. Moving on. Are there key steps that firms, consumers, and government agencies must take to maintain relevance in this future? And Joey, do you want to start first?
Sure. So I think, what's important when we think about sustainability is having sufficient information to understand the problem and understand how we're making progress on it. There was a very narrow way we may have thought about this several generations ago, when we might look at just GDP. Is the economy growing in the United States or not? And so long as it was growing, we're like, okay, that's sustainable. And what we realize is that GDP is a very incomplete measure. It's something we've got a long track record with. We understand what it means, so it has some appeal there, but it really isn't capturing everything that we care about. And so having the kind of information I think makes it easier for us. And when I say us, I mean us as citizens, I mean us as customers, us as workers, for us to be able to act in a way that is more sustainable, for us to have the necessary information. I mean, Vilas can't do anything that he wants to do if he doesn't have the information to really understand what they're actually investing in. I think of America in terms of their clients and whether or not that is consistent with what they've identified as important for a sustainable investment portfolio. Right. So like if we don't have that kind of information, it makes it very difficult to make progress on this. So as a starting point, collecting the information, processing it in a way so that it is understandable, so that it is comparable. I mean, this is one of the big challenges. I'm doing some work with colleagues at both the business school and the law school here, looking at voluntary corporate targets. How companies set their targets and how they report on their targets varies significantly across companies. It's important to learn what they're doing to be able to see where we can identify best practices and accelerate decarbonization efforts in those companies. It's going to be important for Vilas's work to be like, okay, who should we be lending to if they're making progress on that? So part of it is having that kind of information so that we can be more effective in driving that kind of change, whether it's in the private sector, whether it's in the decisions we as customers make in terms of what we buy and consume, how we actually use that to inform the design of public policy when we think about the role of government. So for me, for all of this, in terms of sort of how do we sort of stay engaged and are relevant and make that change over time, it's having that necessary information. And that may mean that we wearing different hats, whether it's as a citizen or a customer or a worker, we need to be placing demands and however we're engaging to say, I want this kind of information. So it's going to inform my behavior and inform my decisions on investment. That's going to have an impact on sustainability moving forward.
Makes sense. This actually is very relevant actually. Thanks a lot, Joey. We can go first all the time, but anybody, Vilas, Chad, or Zeke, want to go next and give your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'd love
Sorry, Chad, let me jump in. I just wanted to remind the audience that we can, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask our panelists, there's a Q&A function as well that you can toss those in. Sorry to jump in there, Chad.
No worries at all. So from my perspective, airports, generally speaking, are really critical nodes between transportation, energy, land use, and commerce, right? So we have opportunities from my sector to be able to influence all of those things, right? We can do things from an airport's perspective, like to deploy clean energy and enable that infrastructure that is needed for all of our partners, airlines and tenants and other groups that work on airports, to really to have the access to things that they wouldn't be able to otherwise, and be able to use our infrastructure to be able to keep them from having to individually, build out, maybe that's new energy storage or it's renewable energy for their facilities. So those sort of things are really kind of important from a perspective of us being a convener of lots of different industries. From kind of a different lens, though, global aviation, it's kind of tricky, right? So today, aviation is one of the hardest to abate industries currently, right? We have only a few options as it relates to air travel to really reduce that carbon, right? So people can either fly less, or we can really focus on sustainable fuels, right? As of right now, with the technology we have available to us. And that sustainable fuel piece is really, really integral right now. There's not a huge amount of availability, right? So it's very little is currently available. And airports specifically could have a very outsized role in enabling access to those fuels for the airlines. As it stands currently, there's a few kind of nodes worldwide where sustainable aviation fuel is produced, and it's shipped all over the world, essentially eroding the carbon benefits that you would get from producing that fuel. A perfect example is that the bulk of all sustainable aviation fuel that's produced today is produced in Singapore, and it's put on barges, not old traditional, diesel run barges, and shipped all over the world, and then put into either pipelines or into overland diesel trucks to be shipped to various airports. And that's not a sustainable system at all. And so to get to a point where the industry as a whole can really start realizing the benefits of sustainable aviation fuel, we have to have regional development of those fuels all over the place. Most airports aren't in a position to help enable that. They're really only in a position to really receive that fuel if other folks build these facilities. We have here at Pittsburgh tried to take a different approach where we're trying to leverage everything that we can to enable that change in the industry. And so we're working actively to build here on site facilities that will do that. And that's going to be really key for kind of broadening the access to that fuel. But right now it comes at a premium for cost. So that's something that consumers would have to absorb in their costs, or airlines have to work on partnerships with other corporate sponsors to be able to offset that cost to keep their operating costs low. Currently, travel by aircraft is dramatically cheaper today than it has historically been. And that's a trend that I think worldwide everyone wants to continue and really appreciates. But things like this, change to fuel dynamics can influence that. And we have to kind of, as a society, determine whether or not we're willing to pay that additional cost to make sure that we're not going to harm our environment, or are we going to, demand, the cheapest flights possible. Beyond that, from a government policy perspective, I think that's our biggest struggle in aviation right now, because we have not seen a stable policy landscape. There have been really dramatic shifts over the last several years in U.S. policy, but also in global policy as it relates to how we are managing, these sustainable fuels markets, subsidies that are associated with them, and regulations that either incentivize or penalize airlines for not using those fuels. And right now we have a smattering of regulations all over the world that are at complete odds with each other. And so from a global aviation perspective, we're really just trying to get it to a point where there's some stability so that we can understand, how to adapt and not have a different approach in literally every market worldwide. So there's a lot that has to happen here from an aviation perspective to really get to a point where the industry can go in the direction that they need to reduce all of that major carbon output that's currently being put out there.
Makes sense. Thanks, Chad, for giving all these beautiful examples of how it is for aviation industry here itself. It's a lot more detailed, and it's also hard to update. It makes sense. And thanks a lot. And Vilas and Zeke, do you want to give your thoughts as well? Anybody?
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of our focuses, and one of the focuses of Silicon Valley historically, has been trying to be catalytic. But you can catalyze something, but it's still going to fail if there's not a bigger stage it's moving to in the future, And voluntary corporate action, I think, is important to start things, and it's important to get the ball rolling. But by itself, it has necessary limits. Companies are only going to spend so much in the absence of requirements to do certain things. And so, carbon removal in particular, because it is almost a pure public good, it doesn't give you the benefit of energy or other things that are valuable to society. It is only valuable to the extent that we value mitigating climate change, necessarily requires governments to play a big role if it is ever going to scale, either in the form of procurement, governments buying it, or in the form of compliance, governments requiring it. And so, we think, at least in the carbon rule space, that we are kickstarting this, but we really need somewhere for the ball to roll if it's ever going to get to the scale that's needed to address this problem. And so, a lot of our work is also thinking about the government side of things. Where can governments play a role? Where's their interest in governments sort of standing up and supporting industries? Where can governments help remove some of the barriers to building things, which is a big problem right now, not just in the carbon removal space, but in energy writ large. And so, I think that any of our actions are only going to be maximally impactful and only really going to solve this problem at scale if there is cooperation between the work that's being done in the private sector and the work that's being done and supported by governments around these issues. And to Chad's point, that it has been a challenging environment because of the changing priorities among governments. And, there is a lot of inconsistency between approaches in the US and Europe and Australia and other places. And so, we only have so much influence on how those things evolve. But certainly, we think that in the carbon removal space, at least, governments are going to play a very large role in scaling it over the next decade.
Makes sense. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Zeke. Lastly, Vilas.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said some of it before, but I think really as a capital provider, I think we, and I talked about things need to be de-risked for banks to participate, just given, risk appetite and where our capital comes from, which is really from depositors, right? So everybody kind of on this call, and, the right type of de-risking has to occur. I think we're really, need to be responsible for driving, kind of our clients to understand where the right types of capital should be coming in, right? And everything that Chad and Joe and Zeke have said about, on this continuum of de-risking, like, you need governments to support with policy and hopefully consistent policy. You need, industry to say that, yes, they're ready to participate, right? And even before that, to Joe's point, you need, academia to come in and do a lot of the work at the very beginning. And I think of the companies that, the thousands of companies on the clean tech side or climate tech side that we work with, like, I don't know the percent, but I assume I'm not far off when I say greater than 50% have come from academia or from national labs, right? This is where a lot of the hard work gets done. So then what's the role of finance? The role of finance is to provide that capital. And I said it needs to be de-risked for banks, but it's also our role to think about how do we structure solutions, again, that might not be something that has been done before, where there is risk sharing. And so when we think about, we've talked a lot about the US and Europe. I just want to make sure I touch on this one point. When you think about the most vulnerable regions to climate change, it really is the global South. And when you think about some of the most, vulnerable regions, they're also not having the most access to capital. And so, we also think about how do we partner, with kind of the de-risking capital that exists. So whether that is with the World Bank, whether that's with other multilateral development banks, and actually get them to come in and, support some of these companies, technologies, et cetera, so they can be, deployed where the most vulnerable are as well. And so there's two ways to do that. One of it is, work with the types of capital that, whether it's government, philanthropic, or, kind of multilateral. The other one is, something that Zeke touched on a few minutes ago about, they're not trying to solve it today. What they're trying to do is say, hey, here are the technologies that will be part of the solution, as we get to 2050. And we need to, one, prove what works, and two, bring the cost down. And I think part of, the responsibility of finance is to think about how do we deploy capital today that will drive the cost down, so it's accessible not just to, the big tech companies who are able because of their profitability today, or the most wealthy countries who are able to because, of the overall GDP. And so, I think a lot of what we're trying to do is say, hey, there's different types of capital that is available. There's different types of risk tolerances that exist in investors and lenders. And then there's different needs, and how do we match all those up? Because I think, when we started having this discussion, it was very much around energy sustainability. And then, we started talking about energy access, and then we started talking about energy security. And now, so we talk about the energy trilemma. And that, really, I think, demonstrates how it has evolved, and our thinking has evolved, and all the ecosystem partners' thinking has evolved. And so that's just the last thing I think our responsibility is. It's frankly to say that whatever we think is our responsibility today is probably not our responsibility tomorrow, in that as things change, as things evolve, as, to Chad and Zeke's point, as regulation changes, unfortunately, we have to constantly be thinking about how do we adapt to that and still serve our clients, right? For us as a bank, again, it goes back, we serve our clients, right? They tell us what's important and what they're trying to do. We tell them what solution we think we can come up with, whether that's using our balance sheet or others. So, as we're doing that, we have to always be flexible, I think, is the main point.
Indeed. Thank you. Thanks for talking about the pipeline of companies coming from the academia and then moving, how it's important for finance to step in and then help them with capital and share the risks, and also able to equalize across the globe, because they have different kind of impact in different part of the globe as well. It's global South is more have access issues. Thanks a lot for all the answers. And next question actually is about AI. So it's all of the news today, AI. And what is your view of the role of AI can play or should play in promoting this particular assessment? and energy industry actually as a whole. And what are the important obstacles to the development and adoption of AI in addition to this? And other actions that can either be public or private sectors can take to promote innovation with AI and this as well. So anyone can actually step in and open to all of you.
I'm happy to kick it off. So AI both changes everything and also doesn't change everything that quickly. There's a huge amount of promise there, right? There's a lot of very, future-looking work around using AI to try to develop new sorbents for CO2 for direct air capture, or using AI to, optimize electricity systems in interesting ways. Um, and so I think that we should embrace that in our work. We should, support those sort of efforts. And at the same time, AI comes with its own challenges, both around energy use, but also because I think that there's a certain type of short-term thinking that's engendered by some in the AI community. And by that, I mean, this idea that we're going to have artificial general intelligence or some sort of AI singularity in the next few years, and that's going to solve all our problems. We've seen some of the leaders of AI labs essentially saying, oh yeah, AI will solve climate change for us. Well, it turns out that climate change is more, in many ways, a political problem than a technological problem. And so AI is certainly going to help on the technological side. I am much less optimistic that AI is going to solve our politics and its challenges. So, to the extent that we do focus on it, I think we should not let it be all encompassing. And we should realize that, humans still need to solve these problems, even if AI is going to be a useful tool to potentially help.
Yeah, thanks for adding. Actually, it's a human problem than a tech problem. So it's about how we politically navigate this to solve this. Yeah. Thanks, Zeke. And
Can I jump in and add something to that? So, from my sector's kind of perspective, like there's really amazing things that AI can do for us to help improve our efficiencies and look at modeling things so that we have new tools to reduce our carbon output. But I think the biggest thing that we're facing right now in my industry is that the AI energy demand is making it much, much more difficult for us to be able to deploy sustainable solutions across the board right now. Essentially, every new project that we try to work on that requires, a clean energy source is kind of getting pushed to the wayside because that clean energy is only being available for new data centers to support AI. And so, certainly in my region, in my sector completely, we're kind of struggling with like how does that really work out, and are those potential benefits of this AI proliferation going to outweigh the actual impacts to energy demand and the associated carbon output from now all of a sudden building tons of natural gas plants to support it that aren't always clean energy sources for those data centers. It's like it's a really interesting balance right now, and we will probably see what that looks like here in a few years. But in the short term, it provides a difficult situation across the board, I think, to navigate.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on that, and we are definitely seeing that. E-fuels, which is taking electricity and kind of syngases and converting them to fuel, was like a very investable, I would say, 2 years ago post IRA because of the incentives involved, and then just that competition for that clean electron to be able to actually earn those incentives, made it much more difficult to see kind of an execution path. At the same time, I think it was mentioned before, because of this demand for energy and particularly, kind of clean energy, we are seeing investments being made that I don't think would happen without AI being this kind of giant power hog. And what do I mean there? And I think, Zeke, it was you who mentioned it, right? Like 3 Mile Island, Dwayne Arnold, Palisades, all of them coming back online. The U.S. government saying that they're going to effectively, guarantee the debt on 10, new fission plants. The tech companies and other strategics investing in enhanced geothermal, in SMRs, and people willing to sign PPAs at prices that make those projects make sense. And, I think the biggest thing that, I've seen is nuclear there was many reasons why, kind of there was a move away from nuclear, but at the end of the day, it was an economic one. And, at least in the US, right? Like it could not compete with gas. And so it did not make sense to continue to run these old nuclear plants. And that was a problem. And so they were shut down. Today, because people are willing to pay, well north of $100, they are now back, bringing them back online. And, and they're able to, and that holds across other technologies, right? Zeke mentioned, solvents and carbon capture, right? Like carbon capture is innovating and improving from an AI, modeling sense, helping in modeling. But again, on the demand side, it's like, hey, people can pay for it now, paired with gas or paired with, kind of other, non-clean energy sources. So the last example I'll give, because I think it's just a really cool stat, is just, I think Microsoft a couple of years ago put out a paper, I think with IBM, saying that, battery storage is a big part of the need for the grid, for grid stabilization, as well as for clean power and, 24/7 power. And they were looking to research new materials to remove lithium as a main component in batteries, because that's, kind of from a supply chain standpoint, it's the hardest to source, and both from an environmental standpoint and then just the supply chain. And they reviewed 32 million materials in 80 hours, right? Like that would have been, I don't know how many, 8,000 years, who knows, right? Like, in the traditional way that people have been testing different battery materials. So as much as, I agree with what everybody has said, to me, the really exciting thing is there will be leaps in advancements that AI will propel. I completely agree with Zeke that it is the energy transition and climate is a political issue, so it will not solve, AI is not going to solve that. But, when you have these leaps in technology, it makes some of the political friction a little bit easier if you're able to say, well, it doesn't cost you anything, right? It doesn't mean you have given something up. It doesn't mean you pay more for it. It doesn't mean that like jobs are lost, or that opportunities are changed. Like there's new opportunities that come. It is at a cost-effective basis. It is something that can be deployed. So, all of that in my mind is the hope and maybe the hype. And we are kind of responsible for seeing it executed in a way that it is beneficial. But as much as it is can be attacked on the power side of things, I do think it is also, a potential propellant for, advancing towards a more low carbon economy.
Makes sense.
I would just like to add, AI is a tool, and the impact it's going to have on sustainability is going to be a function of how we intend to use the tool. What is the strategy for companies, or for that matter, individuals, and how we use AI and how that relates to sustainability, and what's the policy framework that's going to inform what we produce with AI and the application of those outputs to enhance sustainability. I mean, I think of it as a professor, when AI, when we started thinking about Gen AI technologies, the question is like, how do we use this in our teaching? And the thing that we want to stress is that we don't want AI to be a substitute for learning. We want it to complement learning. How do we, when we're training students, learn to teach them to use AI to become better learners, right? So like that is informing how we're actually using AI in the classroom and in our assignments. Just like a generation ago, it's like you don't have to go to the Stacks and Widener library to learn. You can use this thing called the internet. It's going to enable you to learn faster, to get access to new knowledge faster than you did the old way of walking into the stacks of the university library. So it's all about how we're going to think about using this tool. And that is, I think, going to be more important. It may be a way to help leverage new investment in nuclear, as we've already heard about on the generation side. It may create the kind of knowledge we need when we think about applications and solutions to accelerate more sustainable development. But the key thing then is having that I think clear, intentional focus in both strategy from the corporate side and from policy on the government side.
Makes sense. So AI is a key enabler, and we would actually, of course, have to go through like a huge change with regards to energy requirements as well, but also help us fast forward the transition very fast over here. But thanks a lot for all the suggestions. And next question actually is like we at the business school talking to students, and many of you want to work in this roles directly or related to it. So it's natural to ask, what are the key skills and knowledge that which leaders will require in this industry, and what are we going to need as well? Anybody wants to jump in?
I thought Joe would jump in. He's at a university.
I'm at a university, but I've actually never worked in the for-profit sector. So, but Vilas, I'll take this first and say I think to understand and make progress in sustainability, having the capacity to synthesize across different lines of insight and analysis is critical. That sustainability by its very nature, it requires you to understand the economics, it understands the engineering, understand the science. Like to really do and make progress on this, I think you need to have that capacity. So it's that kind of skill set that you need to develop so that you can really synthesize across different disciplines and lines of analysis, I think is what can best prepare you for how you would work in the private sector on sustainability. But let me turn it over to people who actually work in the private sector on sustainability for their thoughts on that too.
Yeah, happy to jump in. As someone who's worked in academia, in the nonprofit sort of think tank world, and in the private sector, they're definitely very different. One thing I noticed immediately when I went to Stripe after working at the Breakthrough Institute was just how quickly things moved. I was used to spending 6 months on a research project, writing a 200-page report with 100 charts and graphs, or at least dozen charts and graphs. Here it's like, okay, we're going to do this thing. We're going to turn it around in 2 weeks. We need this, 5 bullet point thing to go to leadership. So like synthesizing a huge amount of knowledge into small and actionable items, I feel like is definitely one thing that, I've had to learn how to do with this job. Another thing is just to be able to have a very effective bullshit detector. And by that, I mean that increasingly, folks are using AI for research. There's a lot of information there that's good. There's a lot of information there that might not be good. And being able to differentiate between that is important, and be able to effectively diligence what other people are telling you. There's a lot of companies who are trying to pitch you ideas. Some of those ideas are good ideas. Some of those ideas are really not good ideas, but they make it seem really compelling in that pitch. And so, it depends on your role in the private sector. Like I probably do a lot more diligence than you would do if you were doing sort of traditional corporate sustainability. But that having a good bullshit detector, I think, is something that really helps you in the private sector because so many people are trying to sell you things in general in a way that's not true in more of an academic environment.
Maybe I'll.
No, sorry, go ahead, Vilas.
I think of it twofold. One, I'll just say I'm really excited that there is a role within finance now that is focused on sustainability. Like I mentioned, I graduated almost 25 years ago. There wasn't a natural path. There was path if you were in environmental sciences or material sciences or, kind of engineering, but there wasn't really on the capital side. And I think that's exciting. I think, I wouldn't say that there's a special skill that you need beyond what Joe mentioned, right? Which is being able to synthesize across kind of technical aspects, commercial aspects, and policy. But I think the other thing that I really think is necessary is a passion, right? Because it is, there are many things you can do in finance that, exist today that are what I would call, well-established sectors that have needed capital and have models to provide capital to them, whether it's through corporate finance or through, public markets, private markets, whatever it may be. I think, sustainability tends to be, as all the things we talked about, like it's being built as we go. And the structures in finance are also changing and being built as we go. And so, having the flexibility is important, but also having the passion to do it, frankly. And, wanting to, be in an environment where you are subject to probably more volatility than you would be if you wanted to just work on a bond trading desk or work in equity capital markets or, I can name 50 different groups. But so that I think is one thing that I would say is very important for students. I think the second thing I would say, though, is I think it's also important to have, kind of where you want have impact, because as Zeke has said and others have said, like, there are things in procurement, there are things in, actually doing some of the engineering and science behind, new technologies. Like, being prepared to understand, where you have the most interest, I think is important. But while I say that, I think, this is no different than everything that has ever gone through an entrepreneurial cycle, which is, being able to do multiple things, but also identifying what you're good at and what you're not good at, right? We talked earlier that a lot of these technologies come out of universities, they come out of national labs. They are driven by, the true entrepreneurs and the technical people who are able to do this. But being able to say, hey, maybe taking it, past technical, readiness needs somebody who is actually much better at capital structure, or needs somebody who's actually really good at government policy, because as Chad has pointed out, in the aviation industry, it is the fact that there is disparate policy. And, to make this thing work, I'm just going to need to be somebody who has that, ability to make those connections. So I don't think, there's one answer. It's about, being flexible, being passionate, and then recognizing your strengths and where you need help, to do the things that, frankly, you aren't, or, the organization that you're part of aren't as strong as.
Yeah, and if I can just add, in my experience, it seems like sustainability professionals have to have a sort of jack of all trades mentality, right? This is an all of the above sort of industry where you're going to need to be able to have some level of literacy and, data analytics and systems thinking, but you're also going to need to have some technical skills related to all these various technologies, and to be able to kind of understand how that works, and have a ability to interpret policy and things of that nature. So it really just takes an inquisitive person, inquisitive mind that's willing to dig into all this very, very vast kind of aspects of the industry. But honestly, more than anything, sustainability people need to really have a good foundation in how to convene stakeholders, and to really build partnerships and groundswells of support, because that is honestly the thing that I see people struggle with the most. It's all the soft skill stuff, right? So yes, you need to be able to have a an analytical mind to cover everything, but also you need to be able to bring people together, and that's really what a lot of this is about at the end of the day.
Indeed, being leaders about being also be able to rally people, and then work for a common goal or purpose. And of course, each one of you told a very good point. Being having the passion, being able to like call out the BS is really important to be in this kind of industry. Thanks a lot for all of your thoughts. And the next question is: there's a lot of difficulty and difficult environmental and social news that we are actually bombarded with every day. And could you each briefly highlight a kind of a work which you've done so far, or involved in so far, which gives you hope for a certain future, actually? Anybody wants to go first?
I'll go first. I think what you said is definitely resonates, and I think we've all talked about, the challenges. I think you're right. Like, it's fun to celebrate and necessary to celebrate the wins and talk about, the successes that we've had. I talked a little bit about the Minnesota SAF Hub, and that we're a part of. That's one kind of effort that, has seen results. But for me personally, the model that we follow in the business that I'm responsible for really is, meet companies at a very, very early stage, meet, the VCs, have them kind of indicate to us, who are the interesting companies, what are the interesting ideas, what are the different types of capital do they need, where can we be helpful? And this might sound silly, but, it starts for us really at the very beginning, which is like, hey, companies need bank accounts, and companies need, just payment services, and just very simple things, which, frankly, myself as a, kind of trader and, investment banker have never really thought about, but, doing that, and then, kind of being with them on their journey. And we recently have an example where, a company that, we met 4.5 years ago, providing those exact early stage things for, a company that was probably 3 or 4 years old at that point, but, was growing over time. They've de-risked their technology. They're in the enhanced geothermal space. They are, one of the companies that now today is looked at as, kind of preeminent and able to, probably tap public markets soon. we have provided, banking to them. We provided advice to them. We're providing, project capital now to them. So actually financing them, with our balance sheet. And like I said, they seem soon to be, tapping public markets, and they will produce electrons on the grid, in the next 6 months and deliver them, firm power, 24/7 baseload. And, not to say it was, easy, but looking at it and seeing all of the different things that we've talked about today that supported it, and really saying that it was, entrepreneurs who came at it from, they were at Stanford. They came out of Stanford and, started the company. So again, universities supporting kind of these early ideas. It was, working with industry, right? And I don't think we've talked a lot about this, but strategics play such a huge role in investing in new technology, right? We don't need to make everything new. It's leveraging the know-how that exists in a lot of companies that are out there today. So, a lot of companies that are, were associated with subsurface work or with power generation, invested in this company and really brought them along. And then it was, the customers who need it, and bringing them, and demand to say, yes, we will pay for this that we were talking about before, and we'll pay more because it's clean, firm baseload power, all of that. And then finding, the financiers and say, yes, we will do this. And so I like that story because it has been, almost a 10-year journey for them. I guess 8 years. They've done it under multiple different political administrations. They've done it under multiple different, kind of power demand scenarios. They've done it under multiple, economic cycles, frankly, and through, COVID, which was a big disruptor. And so they've proven that, kind of with all of these right partners, which we talked about, I think even just saying how do you have a career in sustainability? With these right partners, they're able to now say that they're going to put electrons on the grid, which, for me shows that even when there is headwinds, right, there are things that people just agree with, which is hey, this is about good jobs. This is about, bringing power that is, a firm baseload and necessary. And it's about, investing in technologies that work and people getting returns, frankly, that, make economic sense. This is what we said at the beginning. So it's proving out that, the cycle works under multiple different, kind of scenarios in my mind. So that's one win that I think, kind of gives me hope that, there's, and this is just one, to be clear, there's others, but there will be this continued development and de-risking that allows people to say, yeah, we reached our goal, and now we can just be thought of as a company, not a sustainable company or a, early stage company.
That's insightful. Chad, you raised your hand. Do you want to go?
Yeah. So, I talked a little bit about some of the stuff that we've done here with building out, SAF plants and hydrogen production, microgrids around the airport. And those are all great projects, and they're, they give me some hope. But really, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that I hadn't mentioned previously. So here at our airport, we have developed a technology incubator that really focuses on giving startups and entrepreneurs a platform to test out whatever their new technology or their service, whatever it might be, in a real life environment where they can kind of work the kinks out. And it gets them an opportunity to really build their company to a place where they can go to somebody like Vilas and get it financed to kind of take that next step. And we see a ton of projects that come out of CMU, particularly because we're here in the same city. But and a lot of what we see are technology based, but easily half of all of those companies are doing things in the sustainability space. And so we've seen a ton of companies come through here, whether they're building out maybe a biodigester at small scale, and we've seen that deployed recently, or small scale hydrogen production and things like that just really need an opportunity to do some testing and kind of build it out. And I see the most hope when it comes to those sorts of things, because every couple of months we get several new proposals of folks that are early stage companies that are really doing interesting things that are going to have an outsized effect on the sustainability world in the very near future. And so it's just wonderful to get to have a piece of that kind of experience and to help kind of foster those companies. And whether or not they solve all the world's problems is to be debated, but certainly they're making a difference. So that's something that really gives me hope.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Like, actually, indeed, it's pretty hopeful that we can cross the chasm pretty easily as well. Next, anybody? Zeke?
Yeah, I mean, I think what makes me hopeful on a big picture is the macro global trends we're seeing, right? The world
Mhm.
spent a bit over $2 trillion on clean energy writ large last year. Much of that being renewable energy, vehicle electrification, transmission. That's roughly twice what the world invested in oil and gas infrastructure worldwide. And if we keep at that rate in the next year or two, we'll be spending more on the energy transition than we're spending on all global military spending combined. So it certainly is becoming a bigger priority. For me, what gives me hope more tangibly is, seeing what companies can actually do once they get started. One of the really nice things about the work I'm doing with Frontier, particularly compared to my prior more academic work, is actually being able to get stuff built in the real world, to like lay down cement, lay down steel, see stuff operating. And I guess two quick examples of things that have been successful there. One is that there was a team of researchers at a university in Canada who had been working on restoring salmon fisheries up there, as a result of a history of acid rain from sulfur dioxide pollution. A lot of the rivers had gotten too acidic and salmon fisheries had died off. And so, these researchers were experimenting with ways to add alkaline rock materials like limestone to rivers to make them less acidic. And as part of that research, they realized that, it was making the river less acidic, but the way it was doing that was by binding with carbonic acid in the rivers, um, capturing the carbon in the rivers, which made them less acidic, but also removed CO2 from the atmosphere at the same time, because otherwise that biogenic CO2 would have gone back up really quickly. And so, they're now pursuing I think it's a $40 million offtake that we signed with them, to, dramatically scale up the work they're doing to restore these ecosystems and remove carbon at the same time, with a huge amount of buy-in from native communities up there and others, and ended up with a front page story in the New York Times about it this past year, sort of highlighting their efforts. Another example that's a little more under the radar, but I think also interesting. There's a company called Vaulted Deep that we support, and the idea behind them is that there is a problem with sewage disposal in the U.S. right now, particularly human waste. A little bit of a gross topic to talk about, but it turns out that we tend to bioaccumulate things, and one of the things that we bioaccumulate is PFAS, the sort of forever chemical. And because of that, the traditional disposal of sewage on farmland as fertilizer has been curtailed in many places, and they've started burning the biosolids, which releases all that carbon directly up to the atmosphere. And so this company had the idea of saying, well, instead of spending all this money to build fancy machines to capture CO2 out of the atmosphere and inject it underground, why don't we just take all this carbon that we're burning right now, for environmental remediation purposes, and instead inject it a mile underground in a stable formation where it'll stay there for, millions of years. And so, pumping poop underground might not sound like, high-tech carbon removal, but it turns out it's a remarkably cheap and cost-effective way to both remediate an environmental problem and remove carbon from the atmosphere at the same time. So two examples of, successful projects in the last year or two that, make me hopeful.
That's really interesting. Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing that. And Joe, you have anything to that?
I'll note quickly two things. One, which is a thread we heard from all these comments, is the enthusiasm for innovation. And I see that in our students. And they want to think about innovation, whether it's in a new technology. They may want to be thinking about innovation in terms of like a creative way to think about how you're going to finance some of these novel technologies. It's going to be innovation about how you're going to engage key stakeholders in a local community, so they're going to be willing and excited to be a first adopter of a novel technology. But like, there's just a lot of this kind of enthusiasm among our students. You see it whether they're in a course that focuses on sustainability, or whether it's on something completely different, a different type of toolkit or different topics, but sustainability can intersect it, and they're demanding that we think and critically evaluate the sustainability dimension of that in that context. And I think you see that now being played out in the business community, where sustainability is not this thing like on the side that you add on because you need to do that so you can issue a pretty report every year. It's becoming more and more central to the fundamental business model of more and more companies. And so I think we see that among our students, that they want to play a key role in advancing sustainability, and they're going to push that in whatever jobs they go into the future. But they want to bring the best and most creative ideas to drive that change. And so that's one thing that gives me hope, even if we hear in the news from certain towns in certain parts of this country, maybe our capital, where the news isn't all that great, that gives me hope. The other thing that gives me hope is that when I started working on the issue of climate change 28 years ago, we were concerned about the world warming to like maybe 4 degrees C. I mean,
Yeah.
Zeke can correct me on this, but we were looking at a world that like it looked pretty bad. It looked really hot. And now our best guess is that it's not meeting those goals we've heard from Paris a decade ago of 1.5 to 2 degrees C. And some of my students are very concerned about that, and justifiably so. But I think we're taking 4 degrees C or 5 degrees C by end of century. Those are no longer as plausible. In fact, they seem quite unlikely, given the kind of innovation, some of which Zeke was just talking about in clean energy, that we've been able to realize. And since I care more about every ton counts, um, I believe in the value, I think, of trying to mobilize people with ambitious goals. But at the end of the day, I care about the consequences. And if we can do things to take another ton out of the atmosphere or prevent another ton from going up, that's great. And so we've done a lot on that every ton counts margin, even if it's not quite enough for 1.5 or 2 degrees C. I just think that we've really done a lot sort of shifting the global energy economy and the likely trajectory we're on. So I tend to be a bit of a glass half full person when looking at that. There's still more we can do, and I hope we can do. But I think we've demonstrated that with that kind of innovation and creativity, we can make important progress in tackling climate change.
Thanks for pointing. Actually, it's the fire in the belly actually it drives the world. Thanks for pointing that out. Thanks a lot, Jeff. And I'll give it off to Cooper to run the Q&A for the audience.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Joe. That was a good transition into our first question from the audience. Zeke, you discussed a little bit of the direct air capture programs that you are working with. What do you see as the key obstacles to deploying those direct air capture systems in the US? And what do you see as the primary obstacles you're trying to get over?
Yeah, so there's a few different obstacles for direct air capture, and stepping back a little bit, direct air capture is one of many different durable carbon removal technologies. In some ways, it's the most expensive today, but also the one that has the most potential in the long term because all you need is geologic storage, which we have enough globally to take all the carbon we'd ever need out of the atmosphere, and free or close to free clean electricity, which we don't have today, but we might have later in the century if we get lucky with some of these bets we're making today. But the challenges we're having right now, there's a couple. One is reducing the energy use of the process. Today it's somewhere in the realm of 2.5 megawatt hours per ton of carbon removed from the atmosphere, which is a lot. And that's particularly challenging given the lack of clean energy availability today, which is in part due to AI and the huge demands for it right now, as Chad was mentioning earlier. And so just getting a clean energy facility built alongside your direct air capture plant is really, really hard, particularly for smaller projects today. Another challenge that we're seeing is on the storage side and the transport of CO2. There's been a lot of opposition in certain areas, like the US Midwest, to CO2 pipelines being built. There's more recently been some opposition in places like Louisiana for injection wells being built. And so getting more community buy-in around those. Some of that opposition is driven by community concerns. Some of it is, ideological, this thing being seen as a green technology and that being a waste of money. And so getting around those is important and creating more clarity around the storage of the CO2. I think I'd probably highlight those as the primary challenges right now. And then obviously getting the energy use down also significantly reduces the cost of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Energy is really the motivating factor behind most of this conversation, it sounds like. The next question is for you, Vilas, kind of riding on the same asset management discussion. Where do you see the role of environmental, social, and governance criteria in asset management, given our current policy climate that we exist in, and how do you see that changing over the last couple of years and changing over the coming years?
Yeah, thanks. So I'll speak, and I assume asset management is meaning more broadly because we think of we do lending, we don't do asset management in my particular mandate. But what I would say is really what I said from the beginning, which is I think at the end of the day we're a service provider, right? It sounds unglorious when you phrase it that way, but we have clients, and our clients tell us what's important to them and what they're trying to accomplish, and we are there to try and help them. And so, as our clients are telling us more and more that they're focused on, investments or in decarbonizing their business or decarbonizing their supply chain, that's important for us to, respond to and say that, yes, we have solutions for that. We have other clients who are saying that, something else is important to them, right? Like they're saying, hey, I need to build a factory because, the nearshoring of my supply chain is more important. And so we respond to that and, provide capital if it meets our risk parameters, right? So I think the most important thing that we can do is be responsive to our clients and where they need capital and ensure that it, obviously is risk adjusted and all the things that, when we're thinking about how we are supporting them. But, we really, don't take a view as to, saying somebody should or shouldn't do something, right? We need to match our risk appetite with their risk or their capital demands and ensure that, we're doing that within a framework that we've established, obviously, to say what we're willing and not willing to do.
Perfect. All right, thank you. One last question I want to fit in for you, Chad. Do you see, we had a big conversation about SAF in a couple different contexts in this conversation. Do you see SAF being cost competitive with conventional jet fuel by 2040? Do you see a pipeline towards that?
Yeah, it's kind of a tricky thing to answer. There's a couple of reasons. I'll try not to get too technical here, but today, generally speaking, most of the SAF that's produced worldwide is based off of a HEFA process. That process, generally speaking, is using things like hydrogenated oils, used cooking oils, things of that nature, and that is a relatively inexpensive way to produce sustainable aviation fuel. However, it's extremely supply limited from a feedstock perspective. And so the industry is moving into second generation technology to produce SAF. And those are things that are using like alcohol to jet and Fischer-Tropsch processes. The e-fuels is the kind of the gold standard that we'll like to get to, where eventually you just take clean energy and carbon from the atmosphere and produce the fuel. With each of those steps, the cost gets much more expensive. And so it's really kind of a tricky thing. We can get cost competitive with HEFA, but it's going to be 0.5% of the total volume used. Where now you look at e-fuels today, we're at probably a 5 to 10x cost over traditional jet fuel, and that's a major hurdle the industry is working to overcome. Certainly, as we scale all of these plants worldwide, that cost differential comes down dramatically. And so there's kind of really like a short-term pain for a long-term gain sort of situation where really kind of taking the initiative to put out all the huge capital costs it's going to take to build these new plants. I mean, we're talking for a medium scale SAF plant, easily $1 billion to build it initially. And then you have the additional, ongoing cost of the fuel. By 2030, it's going to be probably no chance of cost competitiveness. And it's just, but we're only a few years away from 2030. If we talk probably 2040, we have a heck of a lot better chance of getting there, and that's going to be dependent upon a number of factors, including some policy change. Right now in Europe, primarily there's a system that is taxing airlines for the carbon that they're putting out there, and so if they're able to reduce that, there's a funding source there between that tax and the cost of the fuel that can help absorb this. Here in the U.S. Our system has primarily been incentive-based, and those incentives have been eroded. So policy will affect all of this, but there's going to be a long road ahead to get to that true cost competitive with fossil fuels, at least in the aviation sector.
Absolutely. We have time for one more question. Joe, we talked a little bit about policy and internalizing your externalities. You mentioned that you're an economist by training. What do you see as the most important contribution of economics as a discipline to these sustainability issues?
Well, a lot of this is trying to figure out how we meet our goals with a scarce set of resources. So we can use economics to try to identify what may be those most cost-effective strategies to make progress on our sustainability goals, given those kinds of scarce resources. So that to me sort of generally is sort of the big picture tool that we can use to enable us to assess different kinds of options in the policy sector, or different kinds of options when we think about strategies or investments that we might see in the private sector, that we can use that as a kind of disciplining framework to get sort of the biggest bang for the sustainability buck, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you for watching the clock and answering so succinctly. Thank you all for being here. I believe we'll have Professor Muller close us out.
Indeed. I just want to take 20 seconds and thank a few folks. Of course, Cooper and Amrita for leading us through a great hour-and-a-half discussion. So many thanks. Our panelists, of course. It was always a great event, and this was certainly no exception. So thanks to Joe, Chad, Zeke, and Vilas. Thank you also to the Scott Institute and the Tepper School, and more broadly, CMU. And just to wrap, I hope all of you here today on the webinar, panelists and moderators, have a great, happy, and healthy holiday season. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.